We're joined now by Alan Tudge and Stephen Jones. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Good to be with you.
G'day, Lyndal. G'day, Stephen.
How are you, Alan?
Stephen, if I can start with you first, do you have a preferred candidate for the leadership?
Well, as we stand today, Lyndal, there's only one candidate. As I understand it, Anthony Albanese, who I've got a lot of time for, has not ruled himself out, but has made it quite clear if he has an announcement to make, it'll be in the caucus room tomorrow morning. That said, you know, Bill, very articulate, very driven, very competent person as well. We're blessed to have two people who could lead the Labor Party in this important period of rebuilding.
Before we get to a discussion of the rules, Alan, you've recently been in opposition. Do you have any advice for Stephen?
Listen, I think both Bill Shorten and Mr Albanese would be formidable opponents, but whoever is leader, I think, has to address a couple of structural problems with Labor, and that is their dominance by the union movement, and secondly, Kevin Rudd, who will still be in the Parliament, and while he's there, I think still will be a disruptive force.
Stephen, quickly, does it matter whether Kevin Rudd stays or goes?
Look, what Kevin does with his future is entirely a matter for him. Call me old-fashioned, but I think if you stand for election last Saturday, then the last thing you should be doing is contemplating tendering your resignation 4 days later. I think Kevin's still got a contribution to make. What he does with his future is entirely in his hands. I'd expect the people of Griffith would expect him to continue to represent them for the next 3 years. A
couple of quick questions about the rules. Are you happy if this matter does go to a ballot by party members? And does this process include the deputy, or is that a separate decision just by the caucus?
The deputy is a position to be elected and selected by the caucus. Very happy if there is a ballot for the leader, which goes through a rank and file and a caucus process. I think it'd be refreshing for the Labor Party. Obviously novel for us here in Australia. In the US they call them primaries. In the UK, in Canada, in other places around the world, it's not novel for them. They find it an invigorating way to join the rank and file of the party with the parliamentary process. So I think it'll be a good thing.
I want to ask you both a couple of questions, probably separate ones, about policy. Alan, you have an interest in the education space. Do you know exactly what the coalition's going to do with Labor's education reforms, how exactly you'll deliver the money, what strings you will attach and what strings you won't?
Sure. Well, largely we've agreed that the same funding envelope will be available that Labor put forward, but we will remove some of the restrictions and obligations that were upon the state governments in relation to the money, so that we won't have inspectors, for example. What we will be requiring, though, is that there are measures to improve teacher quality, that we'll be reviewing the curriculum so that the curriculum is as rigorous as possible, and we'll be supporting as much as possible independent public schools so that the school principals and their communities can do what they think is best for their communities, rather than Canberra thinking that they know and can manage the schools from there.
Presumably, Stephen, some of the strings attached were in the legislation. As part of the process of rebuilding, do you have to decide what you do with things like your education policy? And carbon, of course, is a subject of debate within the party. Yeah,
what Alan calls strings or regulations, we call quality controls. If you're going to give the states or the territories or the systemic schools additional money, not unreasonable that you ask them to meet some quality standards, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, but
as far as the money, Alan, measures. Just a moment, buddy. As far as the money, the big difference between what the Liberals are proposing to do and what we were proposing to do is all in the last 2 years. It was an end-loaded funding arrangement. In my own electorate, it's a difference of about $38 million less that they'd be getting under the Liberals than they would have under our plan.
But you hadn't budgeted for that, Steve, and that was in the never-never. But getting back to your key point about the strings attached, the only place in Australia where there is a shift back to public schools away from private schools is in Western Australia through the independent public school system. Now, why is that? It's because the school principals and their councils can actually determine what is in the best interests of their school communities. And they've been tremendously successful. So we would like to see more of that rather than Canberra thinking that they can control every single element of a school all the way from Canberra.
Stephen, I did want to ask you about Labor's policy on carbon pricing. There are some, it seems a minority in the party at the moment, that think as Nick Champion has expressed, you should allow the carbon tax repeal to go ahead, you should allow direct action to go ahead because he thinks it's a policy that doesn't work. And on a range of policies, let the people get to the policies that Tony Abbott promised. And some people say you shouldn't be fighting the last election at the next election. What's your view? My
own view is we took a series of policies to the 2013 election. All of us who'll turn up to work here for the first sitting of Parliament were elected on the basis of those policies. We shouldn't be lightly abandoning them. Obviously, at the end of any election process, there's a policy review that goes on, but the starting point should be the policies that you took to the last election. I don't think we should be abandoning a process and a policy that is the best on offer. And we'll have a look at what Mr Abbott puts up. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge. We don't know what the shape of the Senate's going to be like, but the underlying principle, Lyndal, we shouldn't be lightly abandoning something that was a hard-fought policy position.
Alan, one final question on the issue of policy. The Coalition actually took up at least some of Labor's policy. You have a bigger national broadband network than you proposed at the 2010 election. You've adopted disability care. You've adopted some of the education ideas of Labor. Does that mean that Labor's ideas weren't so bad after all?
Many of Labor's ideas were good, but there are also some terrible ideas which have caused the economy to be in such big trouble at the moment. And the carbon tax was central to that because, in essence, it operates like a reverse tariff for Australia's businesses. And to go to Stephen's point about the mandate, Labor has a mandate to scrap the carbon tax because they went to this election saying that they would terminate it. Now, I can't see how Stephen can, in the 2010 election, saying they wouldn't have a carbon tax and introduce one, and now they're saying they're going to terminate a carbon tax but block its termination.
Our policy on carbon pricing has not changed from 2010 to 2013. And as far as the carbon tax goes, yes,
put brochures
Alan,
out,
you've got a wonderful speaking voice, mate, but the viewers might want to listen to somebody else as well. Our policy on abolishing the carbon tax stands. Our policy on introducing an emissions trading scheme stands, and unless there is a policy review process that alters those, they are the policy positions that bind every Labor member of Parliament.
You said that you would terminate it.
We might move on now. Tony Abbott is down to just one woman in Cabinet after Sophie Mirabella ruled herself out of a frontbench position. She's behind in the vote count for her seat of Indi and says she doesn't want to create a distraction. Her rival, independent candidate Cathy McGowan, says the seat is still too close to call.
I must admit to an outbreak of hope where the level of optimism has certainly increased in the camp. Well, there's still quite a few postal votes and absentee votes to come in. And in this whole campaign, it's been very close. So no, I don't think we are prepared yet to say we're there. You find 1,000 votes here, maybe there's 500 somewhere else. So I think we are just being hopeful about it and imagining that there will be a recount after this first period's over.
Alan, if Tony Abbott puts certainly the positions that will be cabinet positions straight into the cabinet, without Sophie Mirabella there, Julie Bishop, I think, is the only woman who would be left in cabinet. Do you need to increase the representation of women in cabinet?
I think ideally the Parliament and the Cabinet should reflect the full diversity of the Australian community, and I think the Coalition generally has done well in this regard in relation to people's backgrounds, and possibly better than the Labor Party, which tends to be dominated by union leaders. Could we be better in relation to other areas on gender and race? Yes, probably. I think we could. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is the capacity of the individuals, not necessarily their background, their race or their gender.
I think women are in the majority if you look at the population of Australia. Stephen, Labor had more women in Cabinet, but is that just one factor? Do women get there because they're female? I think it's an important factor. Our Parliament should reflect the population. We had 11 women in the last Cabinet. I think that was a very good achievement. Of course, Sophie Mirabella, a very abrasive person around this place. But there are many men who are abrasive too and combative. Absolutely, absolutely. I am quite surprised that there's been an independent who's well ahead over there in the
in the seat of Indi, a woman replacing a woman, so that won't change the overall gender balance within the parliament. But the more important point that Alan raises is this. Tony Abbott's biggest challenge is that he's got a lot more talent on his backbench than his front bench, and the friction that is going to create for him will start from day one.
Alan, there are a few people who have aspirations who might find themselves still sitting on the backbench after Mr Abbott puts together his ministry?
Listen, I partly agree with Stephen that there is enormous talent on the backbench, but we also have enormous talent on the front bench presently as well, and I think when you line up all the parliamentarians of the coalition members versus the Labor members, I think we've done exceptionally well, including the new members that are coming in. You look at people like Sarah Henderson, a former ABC journalist, you've got brigadier generals, you've got doctors, you've got Rhodes Scholars, you've got farmers, you know, a full mix of people, and I think that puts the Liberal Party in good stead for the future.
Of course, Stephen, the caucus will select the members of the ministry, but not their portfolios. You've gone back to the old rules. Do you need to keep some of the experience you have and put some new people in who haven't been on the front bench before?
Well, I think that's important. We've got to look to the future, ensure that we take up the fight to Tony Abbott and have a good policy offering and a good offering in our front bench as we go into the next election. So we've got plenty of talent within our back bench as well, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of people interested in putting their hand up to move towards the front of Parliament.
Do you have a view of what sort of opposition you should be?
Look, two things. An opposition has an obligation to do two things. Firstly, to ensure they have alternative policies to offer yourself up as an alternative government, but secondly, to keep the government to account. In that regard, we will extend to Tony Abbott and the coalition every courtesy that they extended to us.
Alan, I believe I asked Tony Abbott this question at his final press club address. If Labor decides to be the same, similar sort of opposition to that which you were, that might, it's a different parliament, it's not a minority parliament, but it makes life tougher, doesn't it?
Well, at the end of the day, we respected the mandate of the Labor Party, though, and work choices was critical, was a critical mandate which Labor had.
Rubbish.
We respected that. I'd also say, Stephen, that there was 87% of bills which were passed which were not opposed. 87%. Now, those bills which we did oppose, we opposed for very strong reasons. They were the things like the dismantling of the border protection regime. They were things like spending way too much money on pink bats and overpriced school halls. There were a reason we opposed them, and we make no apology for that. I would not like to see the Labor Party oppose some of the key economic measures which are going to be so central to ensuring that the economy grows again, so that we can have more jobs, we can have higher wages, and ultimately more taxes.
You opposed things that was actually your own policy. You opposed things for political opportunism. You were the most negative opposition ever.
And
well, I don't think the stats stack up in that regard, Stephen. As I said, it was 87% of bills
Tune into question time at any time during
I'm sorry, gentlemen,
I'll
have to end the spirited discussion here. We've run out of time, but Alan Tudge and Stephen Jones, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal. Thanks.